Today I'm shooting Think Like a Leader from the prayer chapel on the top floor of the Every Nation building in Bonifacio Global City in Metro Manila. And later today, we will take the journey. It might be an hour, it might be 2 hours, depending on traffic, to Manila's U-Belt, where we will have a meeting tonight and the rest of this week in our brand new building. 40 years ago, that church started, and it has taken 40 years to purchase land, to find land, to purchase land, to build a building. That building is finally finished, and I have the privilege of preaching there in a few days, the first Sunday service ever in that building. But think about it, 40 years. Many of us walked, it seems like every square meter of the U-Belt looking for land. There were a few times we saw a piece of property. There's not a lot of land that doesn't have a building down there. We would see property, we would go there, we would pray, didn't work out. Other times, we just didn't have any money to even begin the process or even think about buying or building. But here we are on the 40-year anniversary of the church. We are cutting a ribbon. We're having the first worship service in that building in just a few days. I'm thinking about how long it takes sometimes for the promise and the provision and the blessing of God to happen. And sometimes we can lose faith. We can get discouraged. We can get angry, we can get self-condemned, we can go, what did I do wrong and why isn't this coming to pass? But this morning I was reading, this is not a product placement book promo, but here it is, Bishop Jaray's new book, Faith Challenge, Living Out God's Word Every Day. And this morning, it's a devotional book, and I was reading this morning, and his devotional for today was based on Psalm 23. And as I was meditating on Psalms 23, I want to read a couple of things Bishop Jaray wrote, then I want to go to Psalm 23 in the Bible. But when he was writing about it, he said, in life we face one battle after another. What is most important is not when the battle will end, but who is with us. We have battles, they're unavoidable, but it's not when it'll be over, but it's who is with us. Not when, but who. And it really impacted me as I was meditating on that. And then he says, here David shares that the Lord is his shepherd even during his battles. And so God is still God no matter what we're going through. And Dre takes that idea of these battles that we have, but yet the Lord as a shepherd is there. And he says this toward the end of what his commentary on Psalm 23. Peace is found in Jesus and his word, not in favorable circumstances. And again, I meditated on that, prayed over that peace, this mental well-being. Peace is way more than that, but the mental well-being, it's found not in the favorable circumstances or everything turning out right, but in Jesus being there with us and in the Word. So with that, I went straight to my Bible after reading Jaray's devotional. And as I was praying through it, I went to Psalm 23. And we all know this, we've all read it, but I really focused on verse 4 and verse 5. And if we want to think like spiritual leaders, this is at the heart of it. And as we want to lead people as spiritual leaders through their valleys and through their difficulties, then this is the way we have to think. Verse 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So valleys, shadows, death, darkness, not favorable circumstances, not what we want in life, not what we are gravitating toward or praying that we will experience. But even in the midst of that, this phrase, you are with me, divine presence, God's presence in the midst. And part of spiritual leadership is teaching people to discern and seek and find and experience God's presence, not just in a Sunday worship service, not just at a conference, but in a valley, in the shadow of death, in darkness, in difficulties, helping people cling to the promise of God and experience the presence of God in adverse, miserable circumstances. That's what we do as spiritual leaders, but it starts with us. We can't lead anyone where we are not also going ourselves. And then verse 5. So he's describing this walking through the valley of the shadow of death and this temptation for fear, but no, I'm not fearing evil. There's evil there, I'm not fearing it. Why? You're with me. God is with me, God's presence. So it seems like, okay, here's God's presence. We're all good, right? Wrong. Verse 5, you prepare a table before me. Okay, there's provision. That's good. Where? In the presence of my enemies. The presence of God in verse 4. Difficult circumstances, but you're with me. But everything's not okay, because now, even though he's in the presence of God, he's also in the presence of his enemies. You know that's possible? To be simultaneously have God's presence, but also be in the presence of evil, presence of enemy, presence of difficulty, presence of spiritual battles and all types of difficulties. So, but even when we have God's presence and enemy, evil, whatever presence, God still provides. And he says, you set a table. There's this provision, there's this abundance. Everything doesn't have to be perfect. It never will. But we can still experience God's presence and God's provision, even when things aren't turning out exactly the way we hoped they would, not exactly the way we prayed. But this is what the psalmist. But as I was reading that, it reminded me, and I'll turn over to another text and read a couple of verses. It reminded me, I was thinking on this morning and meditating on it and praying it and thinking about, why does God allow some of these difficult things that we go through? And that question, it's usually the first thing we think of as we're hearing the gospel and moving toward faith in Christ. And throughout our lives, and even as spiritual leaders, we constantly have people questioning, why do bad things happen and why is there evil and all this? But it's addressed sort of on the side here in Exodus 23. And we read a couple of verses that are amazing promises. And yet we still see this presence of enemies. In the midst of God's amazing promises, very similar to Psalm 23, in the midst of this divine promise, this covenantal promise, this great hope, this great future, but then you hit this verse and goes, yeah, but not now. It's later. We had so many promises, so many prayers, so many faith prayer walks and all of this stuff, and stepping everywhere we put our feet in the U-belt. And it took, maybe it was 37 years to buy the land, and then we still didn't have money to build, so the land sat there empty for a while. But then we started building, and here we go. We'll cut a ribbon on a debt-free worship center, student center, discipleship center, right there in the heart of the U-belt. Could not be a better situation. While it was difficult many times during the 40-year journey, yet seeing what God did. So let me read a couple of verses that are really amazing promises from God, divine promises. In Exodus 23, verse 25, you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness away from you. Then he says, so it's a blessing, sickness being removed. Then he says, verse 26, none shall miscarry or be barren in your land. Wow, what a promise. I will fulfill the number of your days, so you won't die early. These are good promises. Verse 27, I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. So in other words, your enemies turn around and retreat and run and flee. These are some amazing promises as they're going into the promised land. Verse 28, and I will send hornets before you, which will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you. So this is some good stuff. Promises of no sickness, no miscarriage, long life. Your enemies, I'll send hornets. Wow, hornets will go and you don't even have to fight them. Your enemies will just turn around and run away. What amazing promises. If it only ended there, but it doesn't. Then verse 29 says, oh, but yeah, it's not going to happen now. You're going to have a 40-year thing or a 5-year thing or however long. Here it specifies that it'll be longer than a year. But here's what he says. I will not drive them out before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. So God says, look, I'm going to do all this, but before you think my promise always means instant, before you think that what I'm saying is just magically happens, it's going to take a little time. I'm not doing it in a year. He didn't say how long it would take, but he said at least a year. You've got to deal with this. And then verse 30, little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. So he says, it'll take longer than a year, and I will do it little by little. Oh, God, can't you just do it big by big? Can't you just do it all right now? Yes, he can. But he chooses, providentially chooses, not to give them the land until they have taken possession, until they have increased, until they have grown, until they have become strong enough. And I wonder about our U-belt property. I don't know all the reasons why it took 40 years. Maybe it was our lack of wisdom. Maybe it was our lack of faith. I don't know. Maybe it was the providence of God all alone. Maybe it's a combination of all of that. But what he says here is, I'm going to do all this, but I'm not doing it right now instantly. It's going to take at least a year. I'm not doing it in 1 year. It's going to be little by little. Now, as you think about delayed promises, and as you think about enemies, even you've got the presence of God, but you still have things going wrong, and things are just not turning out right, and injustices are happening, and these enemies, this kind of thing. As you think about that, if you want to think like a leader, I want to give you a couple of things to think about. Number one, think about His presence. You don't have to have a perfect circumstance. We never have it, but we always can have His presence. That He said in Psalm 23:4, I am with you. The valleys, the shadow, the death, the evil, I'm with you. And so His presence. Secondly, His promise. We held to what we felt was the promise of God to give us land in the U-Belt. We held it for 40 years, and God came through. So whatever your circumstances are, no matter how long it takes, hold the promise. Experience His presence. Hold on to the promise. Thirdly, even in the midst of the difficulties, even in the midst of the enemies, expect God's provision. He said, I will put a table out before you, even in the presence of your enemies. And finally, trust in the providence of God. He is sovereign, and He knows what He's doing, and we don't always see it right now. We just see the enemies, the difficulty. It's taken forever, but He has a providential plan for you, for your family, for your church, for your city, for your campus, for your nation. He's ultimately in charge. So let me encourage you, think like a leader, hold on to the promise of God, experience His presence, believe for His provision, and trust His providence.